Thank you all, and welcome to the Fordham Institute on a gorgeous summer day, as nice as we're likely to get. If you survive the next 90 minutes, I hope you will join us on the roof for a cocktail, because it's likely to be the nicest thing you'll do all day. It's really quite glorious out there. The topic at hand, which essentially is accountability in education policy and the federal role therein, if any, has been the subject of a lot of discussion as people have been grumping about NCLB and talking about reauthorization, and as a whole lot of proposals for reauthorization have emerged, and I suspect there will be a lot more during the 6 or 7 or 8 more years that it'll probably take before Congress gets around to this challenge. Including the Center for American Progress's brand new set of proposals, which actually became public yesterday. Copies in your folder. Not long before that, the Thomas B. Fordham Institute's proposals, copy of which is in your folder. Heritage has sounded off on this subject, and I rather suspect that the American Association of School Administrators has offered its advice to Congress about what a reauthorization possibly should or shouldn't do. This is a topic on which there are a lot of opinions. There is not yet, frankly, a lot of agreement. The Center for American Progress had a little tea party yesterday where they talked about accountability in Title I in particular, and the federal role therein. Today is our tea party, which is graced by the Center for American Progress, among others. I'm not going to say our tea party is graced by the Mad Hatter, because that wouldn't be true. How about just by Cindy Brown, whom we're delighted to have here to talk about as part of this panel. By Jen Marshall from Heritage, by Dan Domenech from the ESEA and a whole lot of other places, including having been superintendent of half the successful school districts in America. We won't talk about the other half today. Fordham's own Mike Petrilli. Everybody's biographies are in your folder. There's a lot of other things in your folder. I am supposed to say to those watching the webcast of this event that we are delighted to have you observing. And if you wish to send in questions by email as we get to the question part of this afternoon, you can email questions@edexcellence.net for possible consideration during the Q&A portion of this. There are lots more Fordham resources out on the table outside. I don't think we need our overflow room yet, because we've got a few empty seats still in the room. The way this is going to work is that Cindy and then Jen and then Dan and then Mike are going to have 7 minutes for opening comments on the topic at hand. Then I'm going to give them all a little grief, and they might give each other some. Then we'll open it up for further conversation. The timekeeper in the front row is assigned to notify all speakers when they are running out of time, and if they don't stop talking, we push them off the podium, which now is raised for this purpose. We are delighted that that this has all come together, and really grateful in particular to Cindy and Jen and Dan for going to some pains to make this possible. Sitting in the audience, at least in my eye shot, are at least 4 members of the Fordham board. 5 actually. Dave Punitz, chairman of our board, Rod Page, Tom Holton, Dave Driscoll, and hiding in the back, Bruno Mano. We have a board meeting tomorrow, and this worked out exceptionally well from the standpoint of our own organizational timing. So again, thanks to everybody. And without taking up more of anybody's time, take it away, Cindy.
Okay, thanks, Checker. This is certainly a very different group that I'm interacting with today than yesterday, but it's great.
Much nicer.
We'll see. But it's great to be here. So let's get going. So I have a question. Who said these words? NCLB is a wonderful opportunity. It won't implement itself, it's no silver bullet, but it provides a very powerful framework for dedicated people at the state and local levels to seize and put into action to improve the education and the lives of our children. In other words, the question is not what can No Child Left Behind do for you, but what can you do with No Child Left Behind? Is the answer Barack Obama, George Bush, or Mike Petrilli?
That was very eloquent. I thought that was pretty good.
I'm here to both educate and entertain, and the answer is Mike Petrilli. That was from a speech that Mike gave at the Southwest Regional Summit on Teacher Quality in 2003. I mention the quote for a few reasons. For one, I want to point out that Mike is a great speechwriter, and that I'm sitting up here with some very suave communicators who will be hard for me to keep up with.
Uh-huh.
Now I'm going to try. But more importantly, I mentioned the quote because I want to rephrase Mike's point for today's conversation. Because Mike is right. The question is not, what can No Child Left Behind do for you? Nor is the question, how can we throw out No Child Left Behind? Rather, the question is, how can we make NCLB work better for students? Particularly, how can we make its accountability system better? So over the next hour, you'll hear a lot about cutting and running, about moving away from NCLB. And Mike and Jennifer will argue that NCLB has gotten many things wrong, and that's true. There's a lot that the law got wrong. NCLB focuses on teacher qualifications, but doesn't ensure that they are effective in the classroom. NCLB requires schools to spend limited dollars on improvement strategies that don't actually improve schools. And NCLB labels schools as failing, no matter whether they miss the mark a little or not, a lot. But that doesn't mean we should toss the NCL baby out with the bathwater, that the federal government should have no role in framing accountability or improving teacher quality or pushing for fair funding. NCLB got a number of things right, like measuring and reporting student progress for all students and by major subgroups, and then requiring states to do something about it. That's a good thing, a great thing. So really my main message today is that there needs to be a strong federal role in education, and there are two reasons for that. First is ensuring equity. Since the landmark decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, the federal government has played a vital role in ensuring that students have equal access to quality education, and the role continues to be important. The federal government must also help ensure equity in results. And we know that despite improvements, we have a long way to go with student outcomes. Children living in low-income communities are already 2 to 3 grades behind their higher income peers by the time they are in 4th grade. And overall, only 1 in 10 students growing up in poverty will graduate from college. Second is enhancing opportunity. From the GI Bill to the Pell Grants, from Head Start, from ESEA to the Individuals with Disability Act, the federal government has sought to increase the educational opportunities of our population. These investments pay off. Indeed, the investments in higher education have made the U.S. a magnet for international students. I'm old enough to have witnessed significant change as a result of federal carrot and stick approach through the provision of federal funds combined with the enforcement of civil rights laws. As a result, the black and white achievement gap was cut in half on NAEP until it started to widen again in the early 1990s. English language learners and students with disabilities received education efforts tailored to their specific needs. And female high school and college athletes were offered sports teams and sports scholarships they never had before. These things would not have happened without federal pressure. I know because I helped apply it as a federal government official working in the Office for Civil Rights. Building on these two principles, the Center for American Progress has developed a smart, progressive vision for moving forward with the reauthorization of ESEA. The summary of our proposals in your folder, Checker said, and specifically we recommend holding all schools accountable for getting results with all students, investing in teachers and principals so that they become more skilled and effective, making funding practices more fair and efficient, targeting support to low-performing schools, and investing in innovative practices that bring American schools into the 21st century. Our approach runs contrary to many on the far right who have embraced a cut-and-run strategy, gut education funding, and scale back federal involvement in education. Frankly, the notion that less accountability will get better behavior at the state and local level is ridiculous to my mind. There is no evidence of that in our education history. Our approach also stands in contrast to those on the far left who oppose the use of standardized testing to evaluate student, teacher, and school progress and call for transparency without results. Though I don't mean to be calling Fordham the far left.
Located wherever you want.
Instead, we believe strongly in the federal government's role in promoting equity and opportunity and emphasizing outcomes. We believe a forward-looking federal government can leverage its relatively limited resources to spur change. Yes, we need a redesigned accountability system, and we also need smart, competitive programs that can trigger significant reforms like Race to the Top, the Teacher Incentive Fund, and the I-3 program. The next steps for Congress are about policy, but also about politics. Both chambers must find consensus on the issues. In the end, what hangs in the balance is not a particular poll or election, but the economic and social well-being of our nation's students.
That was exquisitely timed and very articulate and very interesting. Thank you very much. Jen Marshall.
Thanks, Checker. I know that Fordham is all for moving federal policy towards carrots, but it's all about sticks today, so I'm going to try to keep my remarks focused and on time and to the point. For all the talk of accountability that we've had in these days, I am frustrated by the fact that we haven't done a lot to define what we really mean by that term. And particularly accountability to whom and for what, I think, are critical questions that we need to be asking more. What we have under current federal law is compliance, not accountability. It's not something that engenders responsibility at the local level. Put bluntly, it's about completing paperwork and jumping through hoops to get money. It's not an arrangement that cultivates that kind of responsibility taking for real and holistic student progress, and it's not going to yield the kind of academic achievement we all want to see. So rather than answering up the bureaucratic chain of command to Washington, accountability for results should be directed to parents and taxpayers. We're more likely to see progress when incentives are aligned so that schools are most accountable to those with the most at stake in students actually learning. That is, their parents, and to the people who are footing the bill, taxpayers. Federal intervention has detracted from this proper alignment. That's why we need to redirect accountability from Washington towards parents. Transparency is the first step. The next step is empowering parents to act on that information. Giving parents choice gives them the power to hold schools accountable. Now, this was part of the theory, of course, behind No Child Left Behind and its cascade of interventions. But as we've seen over the past decade, federal policy is a weak lever to achieve this. On the other hand, we see a great example in Florida of why systemic reform that includes school choice is successful at the state level. In Florida, parents have access to school performance data that is designed for them, not for bean counters. Schools are graded on a straightforward A through F scale that we all learned very well in our own days in the classroom. Florida then gives parents a wide array of choices about their children's education. Systemic reform in Florida is reducing achievement gaps, succeeding in the very task that Washington has failed at since it started intervening toward that goal in 1965. So let me answer directly the questions that Checker posed prior to this meeting, and then I'll elaborate on a couple of the points I've just made. Yes, it is time for us to turn the page on AYP, and we should not try to replace it with yet another federally mandated accountability system. And systemic reform, including accountability systems, should be a state-level endeavor. So what do I mean when I say that we have today, under current law, a compliance regime and less of an accountability one? States assumed this compliance posture soon after ESEA became law in 1965. State bureaucracies doubled in size in the 5 years after the passage of that law in an effort to tap the new federal funding source and to implement federal programs. Since then, the compliance burden has grown with the increasing number and scope of federal programs. This complexity creates a focus on compliance, not accountability, not responsibility for student learning. Meanwhile, Washington's intervention seems to have brought out the worst in education governance at the other levels. It's led to increased state bureaucracy, as I just mentioned, local bureaucracy, shifted focus towards compliance with federal policy. And all of this undermines schools' direct accountability to parents and other taxpayers and erodes good governance. The original intent in 1965, of course, was compensatory aid, funding for low-income districts to help close the achievement gap between needy students and their peers. Nearly half a century later, the gap remains. We need to be asking why our strategies aren't working. One of the reasons I would say is that over the years, the fundamental mismatch between the federal government's constitutional limits and its interventionist education policy has led to perpetual expansion and overhaul of programs. These have been ill-fated attempts to make federal intervention succeed, where it has neither the authority nor the capacity to get results. So in the mid-1990s, we saw compensatory aid shift to systemic reform. Goals 2000 and the Clinton era Improving America's Schools Act launched a national accountability framework. No Child Left Behind made it more explicit and added teeth, but it hasn't worked. Now we're approaching the 9th reauthorization and having the same conversation. And yet this debate over the mechanics of accountability, I think, misses the point. The core problems in public education today are a misaligned power and incentive structure. Washington's accountability levers won't change that. In fact, the federal accountability debate distracts from addressing this fundamental misalignment. Proper alignment means incentives are aligned so that schools primarily respond to those with the most at stake in students' educational outcomes. That's why accountability should be directed towards, first and foremost, towards parents. Two major factors are throwing off this alignment: teacher union power and funding incentives. These factors introduce motivations that are separate from and too often end up competing with the objective of improving student outcomes. Unions' interests, including job security, salaries, benefits, should be understood as distinct from student educational outcome objectives. Teacher unions exert influence because of their mandatory dues-paying membership and power to negotiate contracts. Likewise, federal funding is an incentive that can sometimes trump interest in actual student progress. When we see states gaming their cut scores to make AYP, that's an example of federal funding as a more powerful incentive than actual learning. Why does this happen? Well, parents have a much weaker voice in the current power and incentive structure. They don't have the power to withhold funding nor collective bargaining authority. On the other hand, they have the most at stake in seeing their kids meet educational success, and therefore the greatest interest in students actually learning. So to conclude, current federal accountability plans fail to address this fundamental misalignment of power and incentives in public education today. Washington should get out of the systemic reform business and leave that to the states.
So when the two of you reach consensus, I think we'll have a bill. Thank you very much. That was excellent and also well-timed, and I appreciate it. Dan, you're on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I was the superintendent of schools across the river here in Fairfax County when No Child Left Behind was passed. But a couple of years prior to that, when I had arrived in Fairfax to follow my good friend Bud Spillane, who's right here, Virginia was already engaged in student accountability, and we had a program known as, still going on, known as the Standards of Learning, the SOLs. So we had already begun in Fairfax County a program of accountability that focused on our lowest performing schools. We actually were into school transformation in terms of trying to change our lowest performing schools. So when No Child Left Behind was passed, the concept of making sure that all of the kids were all performing at the level of achievement that we wanted to be was something that we all applauded. And after all, the bill itself was bipartisan. It had support from the Democrats. It had support from the Republicans. And it had a component, really, that many of us applauded in the field. And that was that for the first time, we were going to begin the process of disaggregating data. that no longer were we going to look at a school performance in terms of the average, which in Fairfax County was a unique situation because Fairfax County is such a large and diverse community that the averages hid what was going on. So we did have a number of low-performing schools that on the averages you wouldn't think Fairfax would have. And so the fact that now every school would have to report their data, not just an average, but how the children on free and reduced lunch were performing, how the kids on the special ed children were performing, the English as a second language learners, the special ed kids. All of those groups now, you would see their performance and surprise. That performance was significantly below the average performance for that school. So that was good. That was very good that that happened. And we owe that to No Child Left Behind. And for that, we need to be thankful. And that's one of the elements of accountability that should never go away. That has to remain. That has to stay. So the idea and the concept was right. It was good. It was something that all of us wanted to pursue. But as the years went by, what we began to see were issues emerging that really were not in line with, I think, the goal and the attempts and the concept of No Child Left Behind. For example, there were elements of how adequate yearly progress is computed that were problematic. Every district had to determine in their proposal to the state a number of students in each of these subcategories who would have to be tested in order for the school to make adequate yearly progress. Nothing to do with achievement, by the way, just making those numbers. All right? So we had in Fairfax, as many other school districts around the country over the years have had, outstanding schools who failed to make adequate yearly progress, not on the basis of student performance, but on the basis of the fact that a particular subgroup, most often either the special ed category or the limited English proficient category, not enough of the students were tested, and therefore automatically the district, the school, did not make adequate yearly progress, or the district for that matter. There are many other issues. I think Jennifer alluded to the gaming on the part of the states, because as every state had to provide a benchmark every year that was higher than the previous year so that by 2014 all of the youngsters would be meeting the standards. Okay, as those benchmarks went up, the scores went down, and as the scores went down, so did the cut points on the state tests. So we see the comparison now when you compare performance at the state level on the state test with performance on NAEP, there's a huge disparity there that immediately tells you that something is wrong, something isn't happening the way it should be. Then there were the punitive aspects of No Child Left Behind that kicked in. Today, for example, we still have in place the 20% set aside of Title I funds for supplementary educational services or choice that a district has to provide, where in spite of the fact that over the years that has not proven to be effective. As a matter of fact, Arnie Duncan, our Secretary of Education himself, asked for a waiver for that 20% set aside, specifically in terms of the supplementary educational services in Chicago. So there are many things that we have seen that are wrong with the program and need to be fixed, and everybody acknowledges that we have those problems, but nothing has happened. 4 years after this bill should have been reauthorized, it has not. I have little hope that it will be reauthorized anytime soon. So our association, the School Boards Association, and the 16 associations that make up the Learning First Alliance here in Washington, D.C., have petitioned the Secretary and Congress to bring about regulatory relief. So the many of these compliances to AYP that are in place now are suspended until we have a new bill. And when we do have a new bill, accountability definitely has to be a component of that bill. But there are aspects of how AYP that need to go away. For example, one of the things that we propose is that we divide accountability into two pieces. That assessment should be based on assessment for the purpose of learning, which is what assessment is actually about in the schools, so that teachers know where the kids are at and what the needs of the kids are, and they can diagnose those needs and address instruction properly. That should be the major and most important piece of assessment. But then we can have an assessment component for accountability. And we have an excellent model in place right now called NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress. It's the test right now that everyone, I guess, considers to be the closest thing to a national test, because it is. But NAEP is not administered to every child, every year, in every subject area. It's a random sampling of students. Something like that, a model like NAEP would be a great model for an accountability portion to state funding. And the other piece that would tie to that is that we are not supportive of the federal government holding accountable every school in every school system in the country, but rather they should hold accountable what initially ESEA was about, the schools that were recipient of federal funds.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to get a bill out of this group, but it remains to be seen exactly what the fine print is going to say. Broad concepts, of course, have already been agreed upon, and now we'll listen to Mike Petrilli demolish them.
Okay. Checker, so cynical. First of all, Cindy, thank you for that walk down memory lane. There'll be a new Twitter handle out there, Old Mike Petrilli, who will hang out with old Diane Ravitch and quote our old speeches to one another. This is great.
We did a little checking.
Good. Yes. By the way, that was during my service during Secretary Page's term. I was right on the party line back then in 2003. Yeah. All right. Well, let me say at the outset that what I'm going to propose here today is not going to transform America's education system. It won't propel the United States above our international competitors. It's not going to eliminate our stubborn achievement gaps. It's not going to do any of those things because, for better or for worse, the federal government cannot effectuate that kind of change. This is not for ideological reasons, but for a structural reason. We know that Uncle Sam is at least 3 steps removed from the classroom, and all the carrots and sticks in the world won't allow him to right everything that's wrong in our schools. Now, Cindy made the point that the federal government has done a lot of good things in education, and that's right. When you're talking about access for African American students, for students with disabilities, for girls playing sports, on and on. We're talking about access. Yes, the federal government has played a critical role. When you're talking about excellence, though, it's too hard for the federal government to do good because it's simply too far away from the problem. So I would argue that the wrong way to think about federal policy in education is to identify the myriad problems that we have in our education system and then dream up federal solutions to those problems, as if Congress could just pass a law and magically things would change in the real world and they would happen without unintended consequences. I think the right way to think about federal education policy instead is to figure out what is Uncle Sam capable of doing and then making sure that he does those things well. Now, I would disagree with some of my friends on the right, Jennifer and some of the colleagues at Heritage, who I think basically argue that there's very little the federal government can do, basically nothing the federal government can do right in education. I think that we have some good examples of things the federal government can do well. For example, thoughtfully constructed competitive grant programs like the Teacher Incentive Fund that's really moved the ball down the field in terms of merit pay and different kinds of strategies around teachers. But I also strongly disagree with my friends on the left, like Cindy and her colleagues at CAP, who seem to think that Uncle Sam's capacity to do good is practically unlimited. Now, here at Fordham, we've been talking about something called reform realism. What we've been saying is that, yes, Washington should promote education reform, but we've got to be realistic about what it can do and that there are real limitations on its power and its influence. Because while Washington can force states and school districts to do things that they don't want to do, it cannot force them to do those things well. And in the most difficult issues of education reform, from turning around failing schools to creating new options for kids to improving teacher quality, all of those things have to be done well. And under the best case scenario, they're hard to do, much less when they're being done under duress. So what does this mean for federal policy around accountability? The 2 main questions. Should Washington prescribe a school rating system like the system we have today, AYP, right? Or should there be more flexibility at the state level? And number 2, should Washington mandate certain interventions in failing schools? And can it do these things without lots of perverse consequences? And to my eye, it's pretty obvious that Washington cannot demand and be prescriptive about those things without perverse consequences. You look at AYP. Nobody will come out right now today and defend AYP with its Byzantine rules and, At the same time, if you read the papers from CAP Education Trust, the Chamber of Commerce, and other left of center groups. Did you get that? Did you get that? Yes? Boom. What you will find, what you will find is that they basically describe a rating system that looks a lot like AYP. A deadline for getting all kids across the proficiency line, and Soviet-style annual goals and measures and all these boxes you have to check. I mean, son of AYP in their vision would look a lot like AYP. And I don't think that's workable. And then we talk about federally mandated interventions. And we all know this has been a total flop. And it's not because the federal law wasn't prescriptive enough, but because the architects of NCLB never really figured out what was the theory of action where the federal government was going to be able to get the states to do the things they needed to do and the districts to do the things they needed to do. Even in issues like school choice and supplemental services that, the implementers of the law believed very much in. But we found we did not have very effective levers to make happen or happen well. All right, so what do we need to do instead? I propose 3 things: transparency, transparency, and transparency. Okay, that transparency is something the federal government can do well and make happen in the real world. It needs to ask for states to make school results transparent as well as school finances transparent. And this, I think, would make a great contribution. So it starts by making sure we have rigorous standards and tests so that you can believe the data, this data that's coming out, that you don't have this problem with the gaming, you don't have the low cut scores. And the Common Core Initiative has made a huge contribution here already. Then I think it is reasonable for the feds to ask the states to have some kind of rating system, so to take all this data and then provide a user-friendly signal to parents and educators saying, how's your school doing? The Florida A to F model is a great one that if states want to do that seems like it makes sense. But instead of trying to prescribe this from Washington, we all get together and try to say, okay, how much does subgroup performance have to count, and value added versus growth versus let's all get in the room and come up with some crazy formula that's going to be on the books for 10 years. You have to trust the states on this one and say, here's the elements. You need to include growth. You need to include subgroup performance. There's a couple other key things, but you design it. And here's the thing. You may not like what they design. Some states, for example, may not put as much emphasis on achievement gaps as you might like. So here's another proposal. Ask the states to make all the data that goes into their school rating system transparent and available to the public. Protect student confidentiality, but otherwise make it public so that if Education Trust wants to come along and do a achievement gap index for every school in the country that's in a Common Core state, it could do so. And it could build its own rating system of how schools are doing on those measures. Great schools could update its rating. Anybody could come up with its own rating if you wanted to and make sure that you had a way to look at these schools. And then finally, intervening in schools that aren't measuring up. And this is where we really need to have a big wallop of humility. Because, look, none of us know really how to turn around failing schools. We have very little track record of success here. We did a study just a few months ago that found that out of all the low-performing schools in 10 states, if you came back 5 years later, only 1% of them had gotten dramatically better. Okay, we don't know how to do this. So to have the federal government say, well, we're going to demand that every school goes through, low-performing schools get turned around, I think for the most part we're kidding ourselves. If Congress can't help itself, fine, have a competitive grant program. States and districts that want to do that turnaround work can apply for the money. So again, that's where you have it. Is this going to fix America's schools? No. But neither will anybody else's plan, I would argue, because the federal government can't do that. And I think I should get points for being honest. Thanks.
We're not awarding points yet to anybody, but thank you very much. So let's stipulate for a few minutes at least the 2 things everybody wants the country to do: raise its average academic performance and narrow its achievement gaps. Anybody that wants to dispute either of those as a national objective is free to do so. But let's just stipulate those for a minute. Cindy and Cap clearly don't think that states or districts left to their own devices will do a sufficient job of bringing those things about, and therefore the federal government should play a vigorous role. Jen, to oversimplify, I believe thinks that states and parents left largely to their own devices can do the needful. And Dan suggested, without quite saying, that districts ought to be trusted quite a lot more than they have been to do the needful. And Mike seems to trust, I'm not sure whom, some clear glass window through which you will see everyone doing the right thing because it will be so transparent. So for starters, Jen, why should we trust states to do the right thing to narrow achievement gaps? and boost achievement? And then after that, Dan, why should we trust districts? If you look at the track record of either over the years, it hasn't been all that impressive. In isolated cases, it's been fantastic, but in overall, not been so great.
So the federal government is a 10% stakeholder in the education business, if you will, and it is overplaying its hand with regard to how much regulation and how many of the shots it's calling. I think that distorts good governance, as I said in my presentation, and getting out of the way will begin, not end, but begin the process of bringing more coherent governance to the state and local level and making schools more responsive to their direct clients, that is parents and taxpayers. I think we see pockets of excellence out there today in states, and states leading the way on accountability systems that work well. I used the Florida example in my conversation, and we've seen that model being aggressively promoted around the country by former Governor Jeb Bush, which were great. We think that's great, and it's wonderful. That is a model, I think, of how we can go about a more robust and deep transformation of American education, taking an excellent example like that and working hard, doing the hard work to replicate that across the country. I think we've too often looked to federal policy as a silver bullet when it obviously can't deliver for the reasons that Mike suggested.
So to oversimplify, if I'm hearing you correctly, if Governor Bush is a sufficiently effective Johnny Appleseed, eventually Nebraska is going to change?
There's no reason why it couldn't. Everywhere.
Okay.
Why? I mean, I guess I would put the question to you is why shouldn't we expect American governance to work at the local and state level? You don't just abandon a state. And,
Okay, I'm not abandoning Nebraska. I have high hopes for it one day. The Warren Buffett lives there, I believe. Dan, what is in the evidence that districts are going to do this without quite a lot of coercion from someplace?
I would say that the success or failure of public schools in America today is all due to local effort. I would point to every conceivable benchmark that you want in terms of education today, and public schools in America are the best today that they have ever been. They may not be what we want them to be, but they're the best that they have ever been. The highest NAEP scores in reading and math, the lowest dropout rate, the highest graduation rate, the highest college attendance rates, you name it, it's the best it has ever been, but not what we want it to be. But the issue is that we are coloring public education in America not based on the overwhelming number of successful public schools, but on the much smaller number of failing public schools. And I think that's a big problem.
I don't argue with any of the facts you laid out about the gains. Some might call them modest that we've made on the measures that you mentioned a minute ago. But are you sure that was district led, or would it not have happened without the kind of coercion from outside that we've been seeing coming from Washington and from some states?
I would say not, and you know the reason for it is because, and these are the things that we're not looking at when we're talking about reform in education. We're not looking at the way we fund education, and that's a major factor, right? The fact that the zip code determines the academic achievement of our students. Why? Because if you come from a wealthy community, you've got great schools. If you live in an urban situation and you have poor schools, you have failing schools. So we're not looking at how we fund our schools. We are not looking at how our schools are governed. You know, we have county systems, local systems, all kinds of different systems, and we don't look to see what kind of difference governance of schools, and certainly I don't think we have to do much research to understand the impact of finances on money on the quality of education.
Cindy, do you believe in bipartisanship?
I do.
Well, before you go further, I'm on page 2, and you said it again today, and it talks about the many on the right who have embraced a cut and run strategy, gut education funding, etc. Is this the language that one would pick if one were beckoning to for a bipartisan solution?
Yes, because I think both the right and the left, as we characterize them in this country as Republicans and Democrats, not always a fair way to do it. And it especially doesn't apply in education. Mm-hmm. For many years, there have been divisions among both parties, both right and left, however you want to characterize this. And NCLB and previous federal education laws have only gone forward in a bipartisan way with, you could say, center-right and center-left politicians in the two parties getting together. It was quite remarkable what happened with NCLB. And, I'm in the, some people consider CAP far left. I would say we're sort of center-left.
But you're using this slightly inflammatory language.
Yeah, because we've seen a lot of proposals in this Congress to cut education and other social programs that are going to make the lives of poor people much more difficult. And to stand by and let that happen without calling it out for what it is would just be wrong.
Okay.
Can I, if I can just point out on the sort of far right, far left, what's interesting to me is that, Arne Duncan's proposal to reauthorize NCLB is probably closer to the Fordham position right now than to the CAP position. I mean, except for, it basically, our position is the blueprint minus intervening in the lowest performing schools. Whereas your position, it seems like, is, keep AYP much the same.
Oh, no.
Well,
no, that is not our position.
Okay.
You want to clarify that? Because
Sure. I mean, actually, we agree. We sort of see accountability as a three-legged stool. We see it as standards, assessments, and interventions. And we agree with you on two legs of this. And also, I think your transparency proposal on what kind of data should be reported is terrific. Matter of fact, I urge all my colleagues, why don't we just adopt that as the reporting requirement? But we do think that there has to be some attention to intervention. I think you don't quite correctly characterize the administration's position. We think low-performing schools should be identified and categorized based on the depth of their programs, not the structure of AYP. That there should be a series of consequences and a variety of supports. But we don't think Congress should detail every element of school improvement, and but it has to do something to guard against this tendency of many states to set the bar too low. We're okay with variations in state systems. But we do think that states should be required to set forth specific consequential action by states, districts, and schools. They should be required to set a goal for proficiency and beyond. You guys have been quite clear about it, and I think you're right that we can't just stop with proficiency. We've got to reward success. And that they should set a goal for gap closing. Now, where you and I would disagree is I would want the state plan to be submitted to the federal government for some kind of peer review and approval. And that I know. But I just think that there are states, the Nebraskas, or whether it's Nebraska, Montana, whatever.
I'd offer up Ohio any time. Go right ahead.
Right, that aren't going to move forward without some kind of real push to set a goal for all students in gap closing, set a time certain. I could probably live with the government not setting the time. Part of the problem is we've had no real negotiations on this issue because there haven't been, the reason you can look at our proposal, and actually the document we put out was a compilation of things we've been putting out for months but we did add a section on accountability, but it's not terribly specific because we'd be willing to enter into negotiations around what would make sense. And I really believe strongly that I'd like some states to come up with some creative ways to tackle accountability and interventions.
So,
but
Everybody should turn to page 15 of your document and read the last paragraph there, because
wait, good thing I brought my copy.
I've been puzzling over it ever since I read it. I'll read it aloud. Congress should not dictate every detail of school improvement, ... A new ESEA should require specific consequential action by states, districts, and schools to improve the results they are getting with students. So this, to me, is a paragraph that's trying to have it both ways. Congress shall not dictate every detail. A new ESEA should require specific consequential action by states, districts, and schools.
How about if I edit it?
I think we're in a negotiation. This is great. Congress is not going to do it. We're going to take it into our own hands, just like Arnie
we could
Duncan.
come out with a bill this afternoon, but
I have a small edit.
yes, I'm open to it.
ESEA should require states to develop specific consequential actions for districts and schools.
That would alter the flavor a little bit in terms of at least the 10th Amendment aspects of this.
Right.
Even Jen would probably welcome that amendment as a start. So, Mike, why should we trust transparency to accomplish anything at all by itself, other than illuminating failure? What does transparency change? It's appeared to me, and I hope Dan will disagree with this, it appears to me that districts and states and schools cannot be shamed.
So first of all, as I said at the beginning, I would challenge the premise of the question, which is that any proposal for federal policy has to make the case that it will dramatically improve the schools, and I'm not going to do that. I mean, no, I don't think transparency is not going to lead to this incredible transformation of our schools by itself. I think it is a more appropriate federal role because it is in line with what the federal government can actually get done. Now, I think if you do it right...
Why is it worth doing?
It's instead of not doing it at all?
Yeah.
Okay. So we are a 10% partner in this thing. The federal government puts in this money. And I think that it can successfully get to a transparent system that says, what are the results in terms of achievement and results that we can trust more than we do today? Right? We know that you can't really trust these state results because they don't mean anything because the bar is so low, et cetera. The Common Core Initiative, if it sticks, if we don't mess it up from Washington, we get to the point where lots of states are using those tests, and suddenly we've got these great apples-to-apples comparison against a real-world standard that's quite rigorous. And I think what you will see is, for the first time ever, states, parents are going to get information about their schools that's going to be much more realistic. Schools in Fairfax County where there's a lot of wealthy kids are going to be told that only half your kids are making it to a college and career-ready standard, for example. I don't know if that's really what it's going to be done, but it's going to be bleak at first and more realistic and more in line with what we're hearing from NAEP. I think that will be powerful. The other piece is transparency around school finances. If you think about the school you know best, where you went to school or your child goes, or neighborhood school. If I had to ask you how much money per child does that school spend, I would bet you a steak dinner that you cannot answer that question. Okay, and it's because nobody can answer that question, not even the principal, right? Nobody knows what schools are actually spending. That is something I think that the federal government could do something about, and again, could have a transformative impact. Taxpayer groups out there that could see that as data, energize the Tea Party folks on that issue, to really dig into school finances and what's going on, and be able to look at return on investment. I think that would be a great contribution, and I think that's doable.
The transparency line of thinking is what got us to the A+ conclusion in conversation with you throughout the 90s, and that remains out there as an alternative to no child.
You better say a word about it. I'm not sure everybody knows what it is.
A+ is a proposal that's been introduced by Senators Cornyn and DeMint, and it's been in the conversation for about a decade as an option for states to consolidate funding streams under No Child Left Behind, or in the 90s, ESEA, and to take that funding stream and put it towards any lawful education use under state law, and in return show results, disaggregated results on the basis of state accountability systems. The addition of that's been nice in the conversation this last couple of months has been the idea of consolidating programs, eliminating duplicative or those that have been on the books a lot and not funded. Just begin to clean up and tidy up the multiplication of programs that's happened. Consolidate, get back to some of that original intent of 1965, the compensatory aid, rather than for the 10% shareholder to try to have all these little programs getting into every aspect of local schools. schools, getting into systemic reform. Let's get back to the idea of, as a first step, getting back to compensatory aid and try to really deliver resources better to those students most in need. Right now, the multiplication of programs, the complexity of the federal role doesn't do a good job of that, and we could do better. So let's take that step.
Hey, Dan, is comparable data a total pipe dream? I mean, you can stand in Fairfax County and look across the river at Montgomery County, Maryland, and discover that the standards are different, the tests are different, the cut scores are different, all the metrics are different, the budget formats are different, the reporting practices are different, the ways of budgeting are different, the reporting of how much is being spent is different. How can you compare anything with anything in American education?
Well, that's part of the problem. Transparency. No one's against accountability, and certainly not superintendents, not the educators, not the teachers. But that's not what's going to solve the issue. You can be as transparent and hold districts and schools as accountable as you want. They have been, and what are the results? Nothing's changed. Because
I thought you said we're at the best levels we've ever been.
We are, but we're talking about the schools that everybody seems to focus on, which are the failing schools. Not all the schools that are doing well, not the Thomas Jeffersons of America. Okay, we're focusing on the schools that are not doing well, and why aren't they doing better? Okay, that's where the focus needs to be. See, part of the problem is that we want to apply the rules to every school in America as if every school in America was failing, as opposed to focusing on the schools that need the resources, need the help, need the accountability, and that's what we're not doing.
So
we need to be laser focused on the schools, the kids that need the help, that need the resources, and if we do that, we're going to see success.
So be a little more concrete about what you mean by focus. We can identify the worst performing schools.
We know where they are,
right.
and we don't even need a test to do that. We just see where the neighborhood is. So we drive by the school, and right away you can see there are exceptions.
So I know, but what does it mean to focus on them? What would you actually do to them, for them, about them?
You provide them with first of all, you begin with quality instruction.
Okay.
You need teachers in those schools that can provide quality instruction. They need to have the resources that make it happen. They need to have the time. We find that one of the simplest solutions to transformation is extending time. Give those kids more time because they need the time. Give them the support. The school alone can't do it. There are issues of nutrition, there are issues of health, there's issues of what's happening in the home. So all of those community agencies have to work with the school to make it happen. Then you see transformation. And when you do see the exceptions to the rule, that's what's happening.
We haven't seen many. I mean, we've seen, let me say it differently. We do see exceptions to the rule naturally occurring in real places without external intervention that I'm aware of. It's the external intervention efforts that haven't worked very well.
But you've seen them right here in this area. I mean, Jerry Weiss has done a great job in Montgomery County with his low-performing schools. Fairfax County for years has done an exceptional job. So what we see is that the very demographic of the students that are considered to be at risk and failing, in communities where there are no resources, do very well in communities where there are.
But one of the things Wiest has done is he's put more resources into his higher poverty schools.
Exactly, that's what you have to do.
And that's what we don't do in the country. And of course, my view is that the federal government has a role to play that says, if you're going to take our money, our 10%, 9%, whatever it is.
8%.
8%, right. Then you've got to do something to make sure that there are equitable resources, that high poverty schools get their fair share, at least per pupil. I personally think they should be weighted, so that the federal money is actually supplemental, is actually extra, and that's what. And when you report the actual spending data, you're going to see that that's not true.
Exactly.
But to me, it's not enough to let every local advocacy group figure out how they're going to force their school district, where no one votes, in the off election time, to do the right action by those schools based on that information. I think the federal government should hold up its money and require, if you want our money, you're going to have to do something about it. And otherwise, you've upped the ante, but Jerry Weiss got results because he did fund those schools
Exactly.
equitably. And you started I think you started the program at Fairfax with
Yes,
the
same thing.
low poverty schools in Fairfax. Right. But there aren't that many school districts that are doing it. And even with the transparency, I just not.
But do you really think that even with a different law that that Arnie Duncan or Margaret Spellings or even the omnipotent Rod Page could have made Jerry Weiss do this if he didn't want to?
No, of course I don't believe that everybody does what these laws intend, but I do believe a significant proportion of educational leaders do. First of all, requiring these kinds of things, just like disaggregating data and holding school districts accountable for the performance of subgroups, brought about attention to these groups of kids that they weren't getting before. Did it lead to gaming? Did it lead in some places to narrowing the curriculum, which I think is over-exaggerated? But, I mean, did it have some unfortunate consequences? Yes. Big, dramatic changes like that always do. You never quite get it right. You've always got to make adjustments, and that's, of course, what we all want in NCLB. But you do start changing behaviors. And there's much more focus on how disadvantaged kids are doing. There's much more focus on what's happening. And schools are more diverse than they used to be in this country. I mean, there aren't that many schools that are doing super well and getting kids, all their kids to proficient or truly advanced is what we want.
Sure.
That's what everybody in this room wants.
We just saw some more NAEP data. No, this is not going well.
But the kinds of attention those schools that have quite a ways to go need compared to those that are just have never been high performing the same? No. But I really do believe the federal, you would start getting more attention to the fiscal inequities and doing something about it, because we are basically a nation of law abiders.
So I've got one more question for the panel, and then we're going to open it up for those of you in the studio audience, as we say, and those of you across the world who are watching this, to email in your questions. I think here's my question. I think there's agreement up here about transparency and even about disaggregation. What I don't know whether there's agreement about up here is comparability. Do we care whether the data on students or achievement or expenditures, et cetera, on one side of the Potomac River should be comparable to that on the other side of the river?
Depends on who you want to empower.
Okay.
If you want to empower centralized decision makers, then absolutely you need comparable data to make decisions about where the money should go and to give them adequate data to do their jobs. But if you want to empower parents and those who have the most vested interest in an individual child's life, it's of less consequence. What they need to know is how does my state test teach content, and is it good, and then to have an audit on that to know whether it's doing a good job. When my state test says Johnny knows third grade material, does that mean the same thing as third grade across the river? And NAEP provides that audit at a state level to do that. So I think we have the tools at our hand that parents need right now.
Cindy or Dan, the comparability question in particular.
So you're talking across state
state lines, because I think it's a simpler problem to solve, though not a simple one within states. I'm talking across states.
Well, I mean, we're big supporters of common standards, hopefully someday common assessments or something close to that. We've actually done a lot of work on looking at across states. We're a very big, diverse country with very uneven wealth distribution, tax bases, and our kids are mobile. A kid who grows up in the Delta of Mississippi may well be working in Montgomery County, Maryland as an adult. And if that student has the same need for a quality education as a student in Maryland, but the resources just aren't there. I think we don't have a good handle on the fundamental differences in the resources available for education across the country. You have to factor in things like cost of living and tax effort, but if we had a better understanding of that, I think it would be
So you're going beyond
good.
comparability to equalizing.
Well, I don't think we're ever going to have a national system of education system in this country ever. But I do think there's a federal role down the road when we solve some of our economic problems. That there should be federal efforts to try to help in some of the equalization across states. I think this is extraordinarily difficult and pretty far off.
Okay, well, we'll have, by the time we get around NCLB, I'm sure all the economic problems will have been solved.
Can I interject on that
Sure.
point? I want to recommend a resource that I think does illuminate us more on the state of funding across the country and shows a little different picture, and that's by my colleague Jason Richwine at the Heritage Foundation, looking at where funding goes. And if anything, there's a slight tilt towards districts with high proportion minority and so on. So that's Jason Richwine at the Heritage Foundation.
Thank you. Comparability.
I don't think we're ever going to have a valid and reliable system of accountability
Right. Okay.
unless we have comparability.
Okay.
We see it right now. How can you compare two states using two different sets of tests and using whole different benchmarks? It's impossible to do that. In this, global competitive world where we're constantly being compared to other countries around the world, the only fair comparison is between each of our 50 states and them, not as a nation. I think we are moving in a direction of whatever we want to call them, common core standards. They're national standards. And we are moving in the direction of national assessments. The feds have plunked $250 million on 2 projects to develop them. So I think we are moving in those directions because of the global competitive aspect and the fact that accountability without comparability just isn't going to hold up.
So, Mike, that Fordham document you were citing is a little squirrely on the subject of comparability, at least in terms of where it would come from.
Yeah, well, I mean, the document itself creates, incentives for the states to adopt the Common Core or something like it. I think probably after the last month or two, we would maybe argue that the best thing the federal government can do on Common Core is to stay silent and pretend it doesn't exist, so that there's not some actions that are taken that are against the Common Core. Look, I think listening to this conversation, though, that a bill is, you can envision what a bill would start to look like. I mean, there is broad agreement on transparency, that results should be transparent. It sounds like there's some agreement that there should be give states more leeway on developing that transparency or rating system than we have in AYP. And I think you can even get most Republicans eventually along with doing something about the very worst schools in the country. They don't mind beating up on those inner city schools. I think the big question is, you've got now some groups on the left who have now made a big deal out of saying all schools accountable for all kids. And I think if they hold on to that position, that we're going to still try to intervene in a school, for example, that whose students with disabilities fall short, I don't think you're going to get broad agreement. I think that the only way you get a bill through is if you say, look, we're basically going to back off of accountability except for the very worst schools. We're going to have transparency for everybody, and it's going to be something that the states get to define. I think that's pretty close to what the administration proposed, and I still think you could get both parties around that. But I think the rhetoric around, must be all kids, all schools, is going to be a real barrier. And we'll have to see. If that's willing to be softened, I think there might be a deal.
Well, I think the wine on the roof in a little while will soften all edges, and undoubtedly compromise and consensus will emerge. But in the meantime, the audience has been very patiently listening. I'm sure there must be a question or two amongst you, and we even have mics to come to you. And who are you?
My name is Brad Dietzen. I work at the Hillsdale College Kirby Center, and I have a question for Ms. Marshall. You mentioned one of the reasons for misalignment was because of unions, and it was the federal government that allowed unions with the executive order from President Kennedy. How does the government then change that around and fix the problem that unions pose?
Great question and a big one. I think these are going to be mostly state-level battles, as we're seeing right now. And there is so, I mean, as an aside, there is so much going on that's very exciting at the state level across the board on education. A flurry of action on parental choice in education. Lots of things that are trying to fix this misalignment that I talked about with regard to unions and particularly making helping bring the profession of teaching more in line with the whole pursuit of achievement on behalf of students. And so rewarding good teachers. One of the things that came out that I wanted to say earlier is I think getting the layers of bureaucracy and paperwork off of the back of teachers and education professionals who want to do right and want to do their best by these children. We know that bureaucracy and paperwork is sapping in any profession. You hear it from doctors, you hear it from think tank employees, but in education as well. It's sapping to those who are trying to give coherent strategic leadership at a building level. And so I think that also the union demands that are distinct from learning objectives have to be addressed. And it's going to take courageous governors like we've seen so far in Scott Walker and others. I think it's going to be one of them.
Other questions? In the hall, you found somebody with a hand? Okay, at the window. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Sean Ellis. I'm from Vanderbilt University, Peabody College of Education. And
I've heard of it.
Yeah. Not to pick on you, Ms. Marshall, but I actually had a question. From a societal standpoint, you talked about accountability at the parental and hyper-local level. How can we expect parents in low-income areas who are notorious for underperforming schools, low literacy rates, low numeracy rates, and low municipal civic participation, how can we expect them to actually make informed decisions about schools at the local level?
Okay, I really dispute the premise of that. I don't think that is at all fair. And every time, I'll use the example, but it's only an illustration. When we see parents have a choice about their children's education, no matter what their income level, we see, by and large, that they go to extraordinary lengths to get a brighter hope for their children, to get a better future for their children. The DC Opportunity Scholarship Program right here in our nation's capital was oversubscribed 4-to-1. For each place, there were at least 4 applicants for that. There's lots of waiting lists for charter schools across the country in low-income districts. One reason we see apathy today in some areas in America on the part of parents is because they've been told, we'll use you for bake sales and we'll use you for bulletin boards, but that's all the opportunity you have to engage. They beat their heads against the wall trying to get a better education for their children, and therefore get apathetic and enervated by that. So how can we energize and invigorate and engage all parents in America, regardless of their background? I think it's through parental choice in education, the most meaningful form of accountability, the most meaningful form of citizen ownership of education.
Other questions? Yes, because we've been way over here on the far right, so to speak, of the room.
Cornelia Orr with the National Assessment Governing Board, and I don't really have a question, but I'd like to hear each of the panelists comment on testing every student every year in only 2 subjects.
Okay, everybody's opinion of whether it is desirable or necessary to test every child every year in each of the core subjects. I think I already heard Dan say a certain amount of sampling might be okay, didn't I?
Absolutely. Again, for accountability purposes, we don't need to be doing that. I mean, Nate does an excellent job right now. No child ever takes the entire test. Not every child is tested. They're not tested every year. It's just a random sample in school systems around America. And right now, it's the most valid and reliable national benchmark we have.
So you be careful, Cornelia, or the answer coming from here is going to just be, well, let NAEP do it all. And everybody else can kind of take a leave of absence on the testing front.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is I think it's a fair question, and I think the concern about too much testing is well founded. And if anything, we're heading into an era with you have more testing. The PARC assessment plans to do the through course assessments, so high stakes tests 6 times a year instead of just once. And part of that is because of the interest in the tests being more valid and reliable, and also now this interest in being able to link all of this to teacher evaluations. And that if you didn't do testing every year, you would not be able to link teacher evaluations to this. I think
or sampling.
Right. I mean, so I think we have to. I think a smart way would be to be very clear. What is the testing for, and do we have to do all of it through these high-stakes state tests, or could we mix and match? So have one test for teachers, one test for kids. I don't know. But I think the larger point, are we testing too much, I think is one that is a serious one, and that parents certainly respond to.
I believe the Fordham report, however, recommended testing in science and history in addition to reading and math.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Go ahead. Testing everybody every year?
Certainly not from the federal level. We should be agnostic on that. And as to whether it's a state level policy, it needs to be part of a coherent state level management plan and make sense for their strategy.
We need to continue every grade testing in reading and math, and we need better tests, which hopefully are being developed, but I would not stop using. And state this isn't static. States are constantly improving their tests year after year. So I believe that should continue, and I think it should be expanded into science, and God bless you, history, if you can ever get there. But I remember those battles.
It's a damn shame when we have to suggest that we should have more tests in order to get the subject taken seriously. But we are
Look,
surely...
I think this teacher evaluation thing is hugely important. We do not have a strong enough workforce, and we need to be working on teacher workforce, and we need to be strengthening it, and we need the help of looking at how teachers are doing with their students to do that.
Hi, my name is Becca Wittenstein, and I'm taking off my Achieve intern hat and putting on my Thomas Jefferson program in public policy from William & Mary College, just for neutrality's sake.
Thomas Jefferson did get around, didn't he?
He did, especially at William & Mary.
And in all over Virginia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that too. I was just piggybacking off of an earlier idea. You mentioned, Jennifer, the concept of parents as really the primary stakeholders in children's education. And I certainly don't argue that they aren't very important actors in the equation, but I do wonder, we haven't heard a whole lot today about the issue of our children's education as a method of training a workforce and remaining competitive, and that the entire American economy really depends upon the quality and the level of each child's individual education in each state. And I was wondering if you guys could take a moment and just talk about sort of the economic implications of a federal increased role or decreased role.
It's fairly cosmic, actually.
I know, I'm sorry.
Maybe we get a very brief answers.
Yes.
Well, it's huge. It's huge.
It's huge. Thank you. That's easy. Does anyone want to disagree with Cindy on this one?
I agree with Cindy on this one. It's huge.
Jen might disagree because there was the word federal in the question.
This is why I'm careful to say parents and taxpayers. The schools need to be accountable to parents and other taxpayers, since parents, by and large, are taxpayers as well. And then we insert one's economic philosophy lens, right? And so if you think that centralized decision making is good for the economy, then you're going to lean on the federal government to bring about educational change. If you think we are more a nation whose economic greatness has been built by entrepreneurship and free enterprise, then you're going to be fairly trusting of those individual taxpayers and parents.
Other questions? Over here. Can't quite see you, but you're there. Who are you?
Hi, my name is Lauren Smith. I'm a staff writer at Congressional Quarterly.
Uh-oh, the press is here. Everybody retract everything they've said so far.
I was wondering if you guys might comment on how you think accountability has played out as a stumbling block as Congress is negotiating and trying to reauthorize the bill.
Are you saying is accountability the stumbling block in the efforts to get together on the Hill about No Child Left Behind?
Or that, and also, is it one of the biggest stumbling blocks, and how do you see that sort of playing out?
How large is accountability as a barrier to consensus about some kind of reauthorization?
I don't think accountability is the factor. I think it's partisanship. I mean, we don't have a bill because the Republicans and the Democrats won't get together. The Republicans want the chunky ESEA, the Democrats want one whole bill, and they're never going to agree.
Yeah, I would disagree with, I mean, I think there is that issue of partisanship, but I think even, you can't find agreement between the president and his own party in the Senate on the bill either. And I think it's over this issue of accountability. I mean, President Obama said we should go to a point where we focus on the very worst schools. And the response from many of the groups like CAP and Ed Trust and kind of the hints from the Harkins staff is, hold on, we don't want to go back to this day when we're not holding schools accountable for subgroup performance. And I mean, I think people understand that right now the federal government's trying to do too much and to try to hold 100,000 schools accountable for whether or not all of their kids with disabilities are hitting the target went too far. But, getting some agreement on how do you scale back that federal role without just going back to the days of ignoring everything but averages is a real stumbling block. And I think that is an issue that's just as much within the Democratic Party as across the two parties.
Well, my short answer is I really don't know why they can't move forward. But I do think your characterization, Mike, that the administration only wants to focus on the lowest performing schools is not really accurate. I think I probably talk to them more than you do. And
I take them at their word. If you read the blueprint, that's what it says.
What they say is different from what they write and publish and release?
No, I go back to my earlier comment. I don't think anybody's been that specific in their details. And for some reason, we just can't get an engaged negotiation around this going. And I think there's diversity of opinion among both Democrats and Republicans about how to move forward. And it just doesn't seem to be an environment where there can be an agreement to even get a serious conversation going.
So Cindy, here's a proposal. You ready to take it? How about Fordham and Cap sits down and writes the bill?
He is determined.
I'm serious.
I'm looking here at something that has the Department of Education logo on it that's in the package. I
know,
think it's for real.
I know.
And the only place it uses the word require is where it says require states to identify the bottom 5% of their schools and turn them around. That's the only place I find the word require in the whole document. So I don't know what they're telling you behind closed doors, but it isn't what they're saying to the world. Questions? You.
Hi, Lindsay Burke, Heritage Foundation. My question for you.
Are you just here to cheer her on?
I've been cheering really.
Cindy brought a clack.
Right. Must be a softball.
Cindy brought a clack too. They're mostly hiding in the back, cowering in the back, however.
Actually, no softballs. A question for Mike.
Yes.
Great.
Our friend Rick Hess the other day had a pretty scathing blog about the Obama administration's hinting toward offering waivers for some mandates under NCLB and intimating that they might tie in access to those waivers to adoption of national standards, Common Core. Any thoughts on that?
It'd be a huge mistake. I mean, it would definitely kill Common Core outright to do that. This is the waiver proposal. It clearly has not gone over so well in the last couple of days, and I think for good reason.
Are they wavering on the waiver proposal?
They may be wavering because yesterday at Cindy's event, the secretary said, "Well, we were just all we said over the weekend was that we're thinking about releasing this plan." That was interesting.
Plan B, he called it.
Backpedaling. The issue is he certainly has the right to waive provisions of NCLB, and personally, I think that would be a smart thing to do, and to do it through regulations and do it in a widespread way. What I don't see how he has the authority to do is to tie new mandates to that. I don't see the legal or constitutional authority, and to try to tie something like if you want this flexibility, you must adopt the Common Core. It would be a huge mistake. I don't think they would do it. They would only do it if they wanted to kill the Common Core thing outright.
Yes, sir.
Carlson. I'm with the Fairfax County Council of PTAs. I have 3 quick questions.
3?
3.
Make them quick then. Wine is waiting.
One of the most common factors in education across this country are school boards.
Yes.
Okay. There's almost been no mention of school boards.
How much time do you have?
Okay. Now, do we want to put responsibility for the state of our schools now on the school boards? They are responsible for the state. What role are they to play in resolving the problem with the school. Second quick question. Mr. Petrilli.
Can you use the microphone so the people on the web can hear?
Oh, I'm sorry. Another question is, Mr. Petrilli, you said that we really don't know how to rescue failing school systems. Okay. Now, after 60 years of trying, billions and billions of dollars, okay, all these studies. I mean, how can you say that? Isn't that an indictment?
What's your third question? How can you say that is not a good question?
Isn't it an educational system in this country?
What's your third question?
The educators?
What's your third question?
The third question is, okay, based on this country's experience with the states resolving civil rights problems in the South, okay, why should we trust the states and districts to resolve our educational problems?
Well, that question I already asked, and we did get answers, good ones or not, from Dan and Jen. So let's go back to the first question having to do with school boards, a topic that I love these days. Are school boards part of the solution or part of the problem in American education, given the objectives that we are talking about here today? Anybody?
Well, we could spend a lot of time on this, and we're excited that we are teaming up with the Center for American Progress on a big initiative on school governance that will be looking at this issue over the next 3 years. And big part of it looking at school boards and local control, and can we rethink how we do local control in this country to make that work better. On the last question about can we trust the states and districts, again, even if the answer is no, we can't trust them or we don't think they're going to do the right thing, I don't think that leads you to say, therefore, the federal government should do X, Y, and Z, unless we think the federal government can do X, Y, and Z and do it well. So that's where I think we get into these problems. That people will say, well, because the federal government, because the states were, once upon a time kept, minority kids out of schools or didn't do right by special ed kids or did all these terrible things, the federal government needs to act. That's assuming the federal government knows what to do, has the capacity, has the tools to act and get it done. And I think that is where we have to take a pragmatic look and say, in our current governance structure, federalism and the marble cake and all the rest, does the federal government have the capacity? And I think the answer is no.
I think we can deal with two more questions before we head for the roof. Go ahead. It looks like you've written one down. Who are you?
I'm Troy Hughes. I'm going to be a senior at Clarkston High School, Clarkston, Michigan. And I was just wondering, how do we get away from standardized tests as the only measure of success and start measuring the problem-solving skills, creativity skills, and entrepreneurship that other nations like Finland and Singapore envy?
Not a bad question.
Great question. Well, that's some of what's going to be included in these major efforts to redesign tests and the big federal investment in that. I mean, I think
the new assessments that are associated with the Common Core are supposed to do some of those things. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
I don't think you can do those things from the federal level, but that whole toolkit is available to local authorities and superintendents and teachers, and it is a good one. And we should use a wide toolkit in assessing the holistic progress of students. But that has to be done, I think, at the appropriate level where you can deploy such a toolkit, and that's not from Washington.
I think there's a good chance that one of the things that our school system does best and that does create a population that is the envy of the world in terms of creativity and innovation is what happens after the school hours, and it's our sports and our extracurriculars and the art and the music and the theater, all of that stuff that is just built into the American fabric. And so I think it's certainly, if those things that all are getting pushed aside because of the concern about testing and get the test scores up, I think that's a real issue. I mean, one thing that's a good check on that is I think that college admissions people value those things very much and try to find indications that somebody coming into college, is engaged, knows how to, is good at teamwork, good at innovation, creativity, by looking at those kinds of activities. And right now, that's a helpful check on some of this other stuff that we're so obsessed with.
Well, some college admissions people, I've been visiting high schools lately, and the grump that I'm hearing in a lot of places is that the colleges are really pushing us on SAT scores and especially APs, and that all these other things we'd like to teach the kids don't seem to count unless they lead to a 4 or a 5 on an AP exam.
Yeah, well, I think that's a huge problem. I mean, if we get to the point where kids are doing less theater and art and sports and all of that after school so that they can do a cram school instead, yeah, I don't think that's heading in the right direction.
Hey, how bad can American education be if we're pushing kids for 4 or 5 on AP tests, huh?
All I'm going to say in response is
fair point. Yes.
As with most good things, it brings some unintended consequences. And a different kind of narrowing of the curriculum at the upper end appears to me to be occurring in at least some places as a result of the AP push. Last question, I think I saw a hand somewhere. Emily Feistritzer. You're usually not last.
Well, more and more I am. It's really clear. I came to this today because of the ad you all did on how this was going to be a different discussion on the ESEA reauthorization, and it has been.
Thank you.
One thing that's truly one is impressed with is how much input the Congress is getting from various groups and people, which I think is probably a good thing since we're in a democratic society. My question is, at the end of the day, when do you think we'll have a bill? And secondly, where do you think it will be on 2 of the issues that have been brought up today, and that is the federal role versus state and local control, and also the issue of attending to the lowest performing, neediest kids in schools in this country versus requirements for every school in America?
That's a real easy one, too. One answer, which I will offer, and then the others can say what they wish, is that we're not going to have a bill before the 2012 election, and the outcome of the 2012 election is going to have quite a lot to do with the answer to the rest of your question.
I guess, I wish I knew the answers to your question, but I don't. I do think that there will be agreement to focus on the lowest performing schools, but what I fear is there won't be much action push from the federal government to do things about 2 things that have a big effect on those lowest performing schools. One's the quality of the teaching workforce in those schools, and we just have to have some kind of incentives, and I would push for certain requirements phased in slowly, that you get the at least equal access to the identified most effective teachers for high poverty schools. I would, and then added incentives for a larger concentration of the most effective teachers in these high poverty schools. And second, if you don't straighten out the funding resource situation, then they're always going to have an arm tied behind them, and you're not going to. And I do worry about how well the school improvement money that is available now, and it's substantial, is being spent. And but I do think there will be a focus on those schools.
Other answers to Emily's question? Anybody?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going to get done before 2013. That seems to be the conventional wisdom now, and I think that's probably right. But I think it's almost inevitable, in my view, that it's going to be a significant shift back to authority at the state level. So come on, let's get on with it, is my view. I mean, I don't know, I get the sense that there's some reformers, on the left who are trying to say, no, stop, let's defend NCLB or the way that it is. I don't see how the politics in any respect, no matter what happens in 2012, would lead to an outcome that's not a significant rollback of NCLB.
I think it's going to be done in pieces before the election and in pieces after the election, unless the Democrats regain the House and they have full control.
But you do think some pieces are going to happen before the election?
Yes, pieces.
Okay. Heritage lives on the Hill. Do you have a prediction?
I think there will be movement of pieces, certainly. Whether those become law or not is up for grabs. 2013 is my call, and I think that there's going to be more consensus building around a more humble role for the federal government. Humble, characterized by many of the things you said, Mike, and I tried to convey as well. Simplification and targeting of resources towards those really in need, and that means simplification of things like Title I formula, simplification of the myriad of competitive and formula grant programs, and so on.
So I think we are done. If you would like to see this again, or if your best friend or boss missed it, our website, as soon as Joe back there works his magic, is going to have the whole thing, and I hope also some highlights of this afternoon session visible for viewing for forever, by the way. You can check back in 2013 and see whether our predictions came true.
Somebody will put it.
Some things are immortal, and websites appear to be among them. We are delighted that you came. The reception on the roof is 2 levels up. The second of those levels requires going up the stairs. If you want to take the elevator up to the 8th floor and take the stairs from there, you are welcome to. It's going to be very nice up there, I think, right now for a while, and I hope you will join us. And why don't you join me in thanking a very terrific panel.